Welcome to the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. I'm your host, Ryan McKern. Join us weekly for tales of cursed media, haunted web series, ARGs, creepypastas, unfiction, and all things horror. Sit back, dim the lights, and welcome to the Wicked Webs We Weave. The Haunted Charleston Exchange and Dungeon. Research gathered by GhostCityTours.com. The Haunted Charleston Exchange and Dungeon, located at 122 East Bay Street in Charleston, South Carolina. No historical landmark in Charleston, South Carolina is as well recognized as the old Exchange and Provost Dungeon at 122 East Bay Street. From its elegantly Georgian appearance to the deeply troubled and haunted basement beneath the street level, the old Exchange and Provost Dungeon has been one building which has truly lived historic Charleston. And, by all accounts, it continues to live in the past every day. Ghosts are said to roam in its stately halls, and the startling cries of long-dead prisoners in the dungeon can be heard. Today, the combined Old Exchange and the Provost Dungeon is now a museum, which offers daily tours from 9 to 5 p.m. If these walls could talk, the secrets we would learn. Before, if this building was to be haunted, like perhaps many in old historic Charleston, South Carolina. But who is haunting the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon? Journey with me back in time. The history of the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon. From the very start of Charleston's history, the antebellum city has been influenced by the British. It naturally helps that the British were the first Europeans to settle in the colony. But it's a matter of how very British Charleston began, as it would later affect the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon. In perspective, in 1670, two English ships sailed the ocean blue and entered what would later be known as Charleston Harbor. They subsequently developed a city which directly reflected Restoration England, the England which they had left for new opportunities in the American colonies. Their plan was to build a miniature of London, an aristocratic English courtside and countryside inhabited by the landed gentry. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the way you look at it, 17th century Charlestown proved a difficult hardship altogether. As one might expect, pirates tend to be perceived as a bit of a threat against the city. Before the beautiful Georgian building was erected in the latter 1700s, the site of the Old Exchange was not void or empty. There once stood the Half Moon Battery, and later on the Court of Guard as well, but it was in 1718 that the dungeon below the battery withstood the first true pirate captives, men like legendary Blackbeard, although this is more likely legend, or the gentleman pirate Steed Bonnet. The imprisonment followed a lengthy back and forth stalemate during the summer of 1718. Blackbeard had blockaded Charleston Harbor and capturing local citizens as prisoners until the Charleston government agreed upon the blackmail. Blackbeard wanted medicine, a cure for all venereal diseases, naturally, and refused to release his prisoners until the medicine was handed over. In the end, Blackbeard received what he wanted. He returned the prisoners with lighter pockets and less clothing. The battle between Charleston and the pirates was not over. Stede Bonnet, a gentleman pirate who had bought his way into business, teamed up with Blackbeard and ultimately lost northwards of Cape Fear. The Charlestonian, Captain Rate, brought their pirate prisoners back to Charleston. The crew was imprisoned in the guardhouse, which is now known as the Provost Dungeon, while Stede Bonnet received a might's bitter treatment at the Provost Marshal's house nearby. Bonnet escaped briefly, disguised as a woman, but quickly found himself back in Charleston. Until their executions, the crew were stuck in the dank, dark halls of the Provost Dungeon, then the Half Moon Battery. One by one they met their fates, the noose at White Point nearby. As for Stede Bonnet, he was tried and sentenced to be hanged by the neck till death. Building the Old Exchange. For nearly 100 years, the Half Moon Battery, and then later becoming the Courts of the Guard, functioned as the center of trade in Charleston. Within that same time frame, Charlestown had become the fourth largest point city in the American colonies, which is one more reason primarily as to why pirates hung around so often. But with a growing port came a growing economy. By 1767, the budding city's merchants and investors banded together to approach the local government. They wanted an exchange of custom house, equipped to accommodate the growing trade and the new merchant businesses sprouting up every day. In 1771, the city finally agreed. Architect William Rigby Naylor was hired for the initial design, and Peter and John Adam Horlbeck, master masons, and also German immigrants, were similarly hired for their building expertise. They all agreed upon building the Old Exchange at the foot of Broad Street, nearby the all-important waterfront. Interestingly enough, during the construction process, it was decided that all adjacent street markets were to be moved. The reason? Because they were simply too indecorous to the nearby new Old Exchange. Since its construction, many scholars argue that the Old Exchange is one of the three most important American buildings built during the colonial era. The other two are Philadelphia's Town Hall and Boston's Faneuil Hall. Leading up to the American Revolution. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party, Boston's Son of Liberty 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. 342 chests of this tea was thrown. Those Bostonians were not the sole American colonists to strike back against the British Parliament's Tea Act of 1773. The bill had been designed to save the weakening East Indian Company from lowering its tea tax and granting it total control of the American tea trade. The act itself allowed the East India Company to undercut even tea smuggled into America by Dutch traders. Many colonists viewed the act as another example of taxation tyranny. In Charleston, 13 days before the Bostonians would dump their tea in a famous act of rebellion, Charlestonians called a meeting in the Old Exchange to discuss their course of action. They all agreed against purchasing the 257 chests of tea, which had arrived at the harbor with the East India Company, and instead of unloading the 200-plus chests, they stored all of the tea in Exchange Building. No doubt, there were some colonists which desperately missed their tea, but in the end, the anti-tea rally stood strong. The Exchange's most notorious execution came in 1781, with the advent of the American Revolution. Isaac Hayne was born in 1745 to a relatively well-off family. He married Elizabeth Hudson, the daughter of the Reverend William Hudson, and the couple had 7 children. Like Hayne's own father, Isaac was elected to President Street Bartholomew's Parish. Prior to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, Hayne enjoyed a very nice living. He owned not only an elegant mansion, 4 miles long from Jacksonboro, but also 2 other plantations, Pear Hill and Sycamore, that attributed to 700 and 650 acres of the total land. Then, he owned more property in Beaufort, and even more in Charleston. He owned 6,377 acres in upcountry and another 1,000 acres in Georgia. Hayne was, if nothing else, a wealthy entrepreneur. By 1776, in the midst of the Revolutionary War, Hayne became a captain in the militia. What he did not realize at the time was that this shift in his allegiance would ultimately lead to his death. The workings of the Crown in Revolutionary America. Alliances were split amongst the supporters of the Crown and those who supported an independent land. Brothers and fathers often fought on opposite sides of the fence, with their mothers, sisters, and wives caught in the midst of the battle. But the Crown ultimately prevailed, knowing that they have some retreaters on their hands. Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander who had captured Charleston, threatened to confiscate the property of anyone who continued to resist royal authority. Sir Clinton also promised protection for those who would support the British. South Carolinians were therefore put on parole, in which case they could not hurt or harm the British effort to quiet the rebellion. And Sir Clinton released parolees from parole on June 20th, 1780. Those who did not swear allegiance to the king were deemed rebels. Meanwhile, Isaac Hayne had reluctantly linked up with the British. He had so many properties, so much wealth, that to turn his back now would have proved a faulty move. He agreed, but with a few stipulations. He wrote that we did, and we would submit to their government and take the oath, but must openly declare that, she said, consider it obligatory, only as long as the protection would really be a benefit to him or till the Americans would, again, get possession of the country. In short, he was willing to support the Crown while they occupied the Charleston area, but as soon as the Continental forces pushed back and pushed them out, he would no longer be tied to the royal militia. Isaac Haynes' downfall would follow. The capture and execution of Isaac Haynes. The success of Major General Nathaniel Greene ultimately allowed Haynes to believe that the British were on the outs, and he was free of his obligatory allegiance to them. His binds to South Carolina were much stronger, and he became a colonel in the local militia. Not a few months later, Isaac Haynes' treason cemented his fate when he captured General Andrew Williamson, an American who had joined the British forces. Crown began to fear that Williamson might be hanged, and set out to then capture Haynes. By July 26 of that year, Lord Francis Rawdon and his fellow royal supporter, Balfour, decided that Isaac Haynes should be made to be an example for what happened to those who commit treason. Haynes, who promptly imprisoned in the Provost Dungeon, notes from his attorney or his neighbors surfaced. Haynes begged Rawdon and Balfour to let him see his children one last time. He begged the council. He begged the attendants. Haynes was denied every time. On the day of his scheduled execution, citizens gathered to stand shoulder to shoulder in the streets. They stood anxiously waiting to see one of their own dance in the breeze for only standing by his South Carolinian brothers. As Haynes was led up to the gallows, a 14-year-old boy, Isaac Neufeld, said that the prisoner was escorted by a party of soldiers to a gallows erected without the lines of the town, with his hands tied behind, and there hung up till he was dead. The Federal Post Office. For most of the 19th century, the exchange functioned as the Federal Post Office. In 1791, George Washington had appointed a new postmaster to the exchange. Less than 30 years later, the 1825 Almanac reported that the Charleston Post Office was the best and most convenient in the U.S. Until the early 1840s, everything was relatively smooth sailing. Charlestonians visited the post office to pick up their mail, and the postmaster, Alfred Huger, held the reins. When Northern abolitionists began sending anti-slavery literature to the Charlestonians via the post office, those same Charlestonians were decidedly not pleased. They immediately wanted to see that literature destroyed. A mob attempted to break into the post office and commence with the destruction, but a city guard stopped them. A second group had more success. Sneaking in during the dead of night, they stole the leaflets and burned them in front of the Citadel, or current-day Madison Square. Another group planned to follow up. Alfred Huger was not amused. He stood at the helm of the workplace, ready with his shotgun to die, if necessary, before he would permit such another outrage. Huger refused to allow the mob inside and told them that he would deliver their mail to their respective houses. What they did with the literature after that was not his problem. From 1849, letter carriers began delivering mail directly to the residents of Charleston. It was the first mailing service of its kind, and for each letter delivered, the recipient was charged a penny. This earned the nickname the Penny Post. 2 years earlier, the exchange was used to create U.S. postage stamps as well. So today, should you have any complaints to take up with USPS, 1849 Charleston set the ways for their success. The old exchange and its accompanying dungeon spent the majority of the 20th century under the threat of redevelopment, until being saved for preservation by the Rebecca Multe chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. As of 1981, the old Exchange in Provost Dungeon officially opened as a historical museum. It is a museum that highlights history of both pirates and proud patriots chained within its damp, dark wells. And in this time of history that manifested a paranormal aura today, in which those who visit can't help but wonder, have the spirits of those long ago prisoners and rebellers ever truly left? Ghostly experiences in the Provost Dungeon. Unspeakable tortures, endless nights spent below street level. Is it any wonder why many believe the Provost Dungeon to be haunted? From 1680 to 1767, Charleston remained a walled city, with the intent to keep out the pirates and marauders. Those who were caught, such as Stede Bonnet and the merry crew of pirates, were shuffled down into the dungeon until their execution time rolled around. When entering the dungeon, you can still see the remains of the original city walls, and if you are lucky enough, you may also catch a glimpse of the no longer living. Down in the dungeon, people have reported hearing terrifying cries and screams, as well as harrowing moans as though someone is in great pain. But it is also down in the dungeon that reports of seeing chains swinging by unseen forces, which had surfaced over the years. For those lucky enough to catch a glimpse of this paranormal phenomenon, they are quick to point out that no one has ever touched the chains before they begin to the swinging. Dancing orbs are not uncommon, and neither are the chilling cold spots that many report. It seems that the spirits lingering in the Provost Dungeon are not content to stay hands off. However, a number of visitors have reported being pushed or feeling invisible hands around them, even wrapping around their throats. Down in the dungeon, it was not uncommon for the dead to be left to rot among the living, leading to spirits that are certainly not the kindest in the afterlife. Ghostly experiences in the old Exchange. Fortunately, the spirits who inhabit the Exchange on the upper floors are not nearly as malevolent. On more than one occasion, visitors have approached what they believe to be as a staff member dressed in Revolution period garb. Only the moment they step too close, it is only to see the staff member vanish before their very eyes. In comparison to the dark entities roaming to the dungeons, disappearing staff members may be shocking, but it is a better experience than what can happen below in the basement. Today, the old Exchange and Provost Dungeon is open to guests each day of the week from 9 to 5 p.m. It is perfect for those hoping to learn about colonial and revolutionary Charleston. As for the spirits, we suggest keeping to the upper floors just to be on the safe side. The Exchange encourages everyone to join them for a tour of the Exchange and Dungeon. It is a unique feeling being in a location where so much history has happened. Please visit the website for the Old Exchange for more information. Thank you for dwelling in the darkness with me again, my friends. Once again, I am Ryan McKern. This has been the Wicked Webs We Weave podcast. And until next time, au revoir.